But it might be necessary, Alexander countered. Bennett is controlling the public narrative. Imani's voice needs to be heard. Let me prepare you thoroughly before the interview, Gabriella suggested to Imani. We'll go through likely questions and how to answer without creating legal vulnerabilities. Imani nodded, though the prospect of having to carefully parse her words about her own experience of racism added another layer of injustice to the situation. As the meeting concluded, Alexander's assistant entered with a note Thomas Whitfield had called again, requesting an immediate update on their legal strategy. The board is getting restless, Alexander observed, reading the note. They want this resolved quickly. Quick resolution means settlement, Gabriella pointed out. Is that still off the table? Alexander looked at Imani, silently deferring to her judgment on this critical question. It's still off the table, Imani confirmed firmly. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. Remember, a deposition isn't a conversation, Gabriela Morales explained, pacing the conference room where they'd been preparing for 6 hours. It's a legal proceeding designed to extract information that can be used against you in court. Imani nodded, exhaustion evident in her posture despite her attempts to remain engaged. The past week had been consumed with preparation for her upcoming deposition in Bennett's lawsuit. When Martin Walsh asks a question, Gabriella continued, take a moment before answering. Consider exactly what he's asking and nothing more. Don't volunteer additional information, don't explain unless asked to explain, and never guess or speculate. I understand, Imani replied, though her patience was wearing thin with the repetition. Alexander watched from across the table, concern etched on his face. The toll this process was taking on Imani was increasingly visible. The shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the diminished vibrancy in her voice. Let's try another practice question, Gabriella suggested, consulting her notes. Dr. Carter Reynolds, would you say your hairstyle that day was unconventional or exotic compared to typical first-class passengers? Imani took a measured breath before responding. My hairstyle was a professional braided crown, a traditional style for black women with natural hair. Good, Gabriella nodded approvingly. You answered factually without accepting his characterization of unconventional or exotic. Alexander intervened, checking his watch. Gabriella, we've been at this for hours. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow when Imani is rested. The deposition is in 2 days, Gabriella reminded him. Bennett's legal team has been preparing for weeks. They're going to try to portray Imani as oversensitive elitist and accustomed to special treatment because of her relationship with you. I'm fine, Imani insisted, though her exhaustion was evident. Let's continue. Gabriella nodded and resumed her role as the opposing attorney. Dr. Carter Reynolds, isn't it true that you didn't directly tell Captain Bennett that his comments offended you? That instead of addressing the issue with him, you immediately texted your husband to intervene? Imani's eyes flashed with momentary anger before she composed herself. I texted my husband to inform him of Captain Bennett's racist comments. As CEO of the airline's parent company, he had a professional responsibility to address discriminatory behavior by staff. Better, Gabriella conceded. But be careful about characterizing the comments as definitively racist during the deposition. That's contested territory in the lawsuit. Contested? Imani's composure cracked slightly. He compared me to a monkey, to a, how is that contested? Because Bennett claims he never made that comparison, Gabriella explained patiently. He admits to the jungle reference, but claims he was complimenting the artistic nature of your braids, not making a dehumanizing comparison. That's absurd, Imani said flatly. It is, Gabriella agreed. But in a deposition you need to stick to what you heard, not your interpretation. Say Bennett said X rather than Bennett made racist comments. Let the facts speak for themselves. Alexander watched this exchange with growing discomfort. The legal necessity of having Imani parse and sanitize her experience of racism felt like another layer of injury. "What about questions regarding our marriage?" Imani asked. "Walsh will likely try to suggest I have undue influence over Alexander's business decisions." "Stick to facts," Gabriella advised. "Yes, you're married. Yes, you communicated what happened. No, you didn't demand any specific action." Sophie Winters had asked to speak with Imani privately after providing her formal statement. Remembering this, Imani brought it up now. "I'd like to meet with Sophie before the deposition," she said. "Not to coach her testimony, but to thank her for coming forward. She took a significant risk." Gabriella looked hesitant. Any private communication with a witness could be questioned during the deposition. "I understand the legal concerns," Imani replied, "but this is about human decency." Sophie stood up when others wouldn't. "I need to acknowledge that." Alexander supported the idea. "We can make it a brief, documented meeting with counsel present. That addresses the legal concerns while allowing Imani to express her gratitude." Gabriella reluctantly agreed. "Keep it brief and general. No discussion of specific testimony or the case details." The preparation continued for another hour, covering potential questions about Imani's past experiences with discrimination, her professional background, and her reaction to Bennett's comments on the plane. Finally, Alexander called for a break. As Gabriella stepped out to take a call, he moved to sit beside Imani, taking her hand. "How are you really doing?" he asked quietly. Imani sighed, the weight of the past weeks evident in her expression. "I'm exhausted, Alexander. Not just physically, but emotionally. Having to rehearse and relive that moment over and over, having to carefully parse words to describe blatant racism. It's draining. We can postpone the deposition, ask for more time." "No," she interrupted firmly. "Delaying only prolongs this nightmare. I want to face Walsh, say my piece, and be done with it." Alexander studied her face, recognizing the determination behind her fatigue. "I hate that you have to go through this at all." "I know," she replied, squeezing his hand. But we both knew this wouldn't be easy. Their moment of connection was interrupted by Gabriella's return. "I just spoke with Bennett's legal team," she announced, her expression grim. "They've added Jackson Harris and Thomas Whitfield to their deposition list." Alexander frowned. "Why Harris and Whitfield?" "To establish that your termination of Bennett violated company procedures," Gabriella explained. "Harris can testify about proper HR protocols, and Whitfield can speak to board-level concerns about your actions. They're building a case that I acted impulsively and against company interests," Alexander realized. "Precisely," Gabriella confirmed. "This isn't just about what Bennett said anymore. It's about your fitness as CEO." The implications hung heavily in the air. Bennett's lawsuit had evolved from a personal grievance into a potential threat to Alexander's position at Vertex. Imani looked between them, her resolve hardening. "Then we'd better be ready." The conference room at Walsh & Associates was designed to intimidate all dark wood leather and subtle displays of legal achievement. Framed newspaper articles chronicling Martin Walsh's highest-profile victories lined the walls, and the table was arranged so that Imani would face both Walsh and a large window with glaring morning light. Imani entered with Alexander and Gabriella at her side, her posture impeccable despite her apprehension. She wore a tailored navy suit, her braids arranged in a simple but elegant updo. Her expression was composed professional, the same face she presented to nervous parents before operating on their children. Dr. Carter Reynolds Martin Walsh greeted her with practiced cordiality. He was in his mid-60s with silver hair and the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the narrative. "Thank you for joining us today." The court reporter sat ready, and a video camera was positioned to capture every expression, every hesitation. For the record, Walsh began once formalities were complete. "I'm Martin Walsh, representing Captain Richard Bennett in the matter of Bennett v. Reynolds and Vertex Holdings. Dr. Carter Reynolds." You understand that you're under oath today? Yes, I understand, Imani replied, her voice steady. Excellent. Let's begin with some background. You are married to Alexander Reynolds, CEO of Vertex Holdings, correct? Yes, that's correct. And how long have you been married? 12 years. Walsh nodded pleasantly, establishing a rhythm of seemingly innocuous questions about Imani's background, education, and career. She answered each precisely, neither volunteering additional information nor appearing evasive. Then Walsh shifted tactics. Dr. Carter Reynolds, let's discuss your appearance on the day in question. Could you describe how you were dressed and how your hair was styled? Imani maintained her composure. I wore a navy silk blouse, tailored blazer, and dress slacks. My hair was in a traditional braided crown with subtle gold accents. A braided crown, Walsh repeated, as if examining an exotic artifact. Would you say this hairstyle is common among first-class passengers on international flights? Gabriella interjected smoothly. Objection. Calls for speculation about other passengers' hairstyles. Walsh smiled thinly. I'll rephrase. In your experience, Dr. Carter Reynolds, how often do you see other passengers with similar hairstyles in first-class cabins? I don't make a habit of cataloging other passengers' hairstyles, Imani replied evenly. My hairstyle is a professional, culturally significant style worn by many black women. Walsh nodded as if conceding the point, though his expression suggested otherwise. When Captain Bennett approached you, what exactly did he say? His exact words, please. Imani recounted the exchange verbatim, her voice clinical as she repeated Bennett's safari tour comment and the swinging from seat to seat remark. And you interpreted these comments as racist? Walsh asked, his tone suggesting reasonable doubt. They were racist, Imani stated firmly. The comparison of a black woman to a monkey is a well-documented racial slur with a long, painful history. Walsh's expression remained skeptical. Isn't it possible that you misinterpreted Captain Bennett's intent? That perhaps his reference to a safari was simply an awkward attempt to compliment your distinctive hairstyle? No, Imani replied. His tone expression and subsequent swinging comment made his intent clear. Tone and expression are subjective. Wouldn't you agree? Walsh pressed. What one person perceives as disdain, another might perceive as simple curiosity. The content of his words was objectively racist, regardless of tone, Imani countered. Walsh changed direction. After Captain Bennett made these comments, did you directly tell him they were offensive or inappropriate? No, I did not engage further with him. Instead, you texted your husband, the CEO of the airline's parent company, correct? I informed my husband of what had occurred, yes. The text message read, and correct me if I'm wrong. Captain Richard Bennett just approached me in first class, referred to my hair as jungle style, and made a joke about me swinging from seat to seat. Blatant monkey reference. Entire cabin heard. Flight attendant, Sophie apologetic, but terrified. Not sure I want this man flying my plane. Walsh looked up from his notes. Is that accurate? Yes. So rather than addressing the issue directly with Captain Bennett or following standard passenger complaint procedures, you immediately involved your husband. The CEO, Imani, remained poised. I informed the appropriate authority about discriminatory behavior by a company employee. The fact that the authority is also my husband doesn't change the appropriateness of reporting racist conduct. Walsh's expression hardened slightly. Dr. Carter Reynolds. You are a highly educated woman with multiple advanced degrees, including studies in sociology and cultural theory during your undergraduate years at Yale. Is that correct? Yes, though my focus was pre-med, but you did take courses in critical race theory and social justice frameworks. I took some sociology electives, yes. Walsh nodded as if confirming a suspicion. So, you're well versed in contemporary discourse around microaggressions, implicit bias and structural racism. Gabriella intervened. Objection. Relevance. Walsh smiled thinly. I'm establishing Dr. Carter Reynolds' framework for interpreting Captain Bennett's comments. You may answer, Gabriella advised Imani. I have some academic knowledge of those concepts, yes, Imani replied carefully. More importantly, I have lifelong personal experience with racism, both subtle and overt. Would you say your academic background makes you more likely to perceive racial undertones in ambiguous statements? Walsh pressed. No, Imani replied firmly. My academic background gives me vocabulary to name experiences I've had my entire life. Being called a monkey isn't ambiguous. It's explicitly racist. Walsh shifted again. Let's talk about your husband's arrival on the plane. How much time passed between your text message and his appearance? Approximately 20 minutes. During that time, did you speak with Captain Bennett again? No, he returned to the cockpit. Did you file a formal complaint with the flight attendant? There wasn't time before my husband arrived. Walsh leaned forward slightly. Dr. Carter Reynolds, isn't it true that you wanted Captain Bennett punished? Not just reported, I wanted accountability for his racist behavior, Imani corrected. And you knew your husband could deliver that immediately, without the delays of normal procedures. I knew my husband would take appropriate action as CEO. Walsh's questioning continued for hours, attempting to portray Imani as hypersensitive, privileged, and manipulative. He questioned her about previous experiences with discrimination, suggesting that past incidents might have made her primed to see racism where none existed. He probed her relationship with Alexander, implying that she used her influence to bypass normal corporate procedures. Throughout, Imani maintained her composure, neither rising to his provocations nor conceding his characterizations. By the time the deposition concluded in late afternoon, her exhaustion was evident only in the tightness around her eyes. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Walsh approached with an air of false cordiality. Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Carter Reynolds. Captain Bennett will have his deposition next week. I'm sure he's looking forward to sharing his perspective. I'm sure he is, Imani replied coolly. Before they could leave, Walsh added one final barb. You know, my mother was a nurse at a time when women rarely became doctors. She faced real discrimination, explicit barriers to advancement because of her gender, not someone making a clumsy comment about her appearance. Imani paused, then turned to face him directly. Mr. Walsh, I sincerely hope that if someone had compared your mother to an animal because of her appearance or identity, you would not dismiss it as a clumsy comment. Racism and sexism aren't competing for limited space in our concern. Both deserve to be confronted. Walsh's practiced smile faltered briefly. For once, he had no immediate retort. Outside, in the privacy of their car, Imani finally allowed her shoulders to slump. That was every bit as awful as I expected. Alexander took her hand. You were extraordinary. You didn't give him anything he can use against us, maybe Imani said, unconvinced. But he doesn't need much. He's already built a narrative where I'm an oversensitive elitist who used my husband's power for personal vendettas. Gabriella, reviewing her notes in the front seat, spoke up. Actually, I think you did very well. You stuck to facts, maintained your composure, and didn't fall for his attempts to provoke an emotional response. What happens next? Imani asked. Alexander's deposition, Gabriella replied. And it will likely be even more aggressive than yours was. Alexander squeezed Imani's hand. I'm ready. But as their car navigated through New York traffic, all three knew that the worst was yet to come. Mr. Reynolds Martin Walsh began his tone deceptively conversational. How would you describe your management style? Alexander sat perfectly still, his expression neutral despite the aggressive questioning of the past 6 hours. His suit remained immaculate, his posture upright, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the strain of the prolonged interrogation. I lead by example, he answered carefully. I set clear expectations, empower my team to make decisions, and hold everyone, including myself, accountable to our core values. Including accountability for racist behavior, Walsh prompted. Especially for discriminatory behavior of any kind, Alexander confirmed. Our zero-tolerance policy is explicit. Walsh nodded, sorting through the papers before him with deliberate slowness. Let's talk about that policy. Section 8.3 of your employee handbook does indeed state that discriminatory language or behavior is grounds for immediate termination. However, Section 12.7 outlines the procedural requirements for termination, including documentation, witness statements, and union representation for covered employees. Isn't that correct? Yes, those procedures exist, Alexander acknowledged. Yet you bypassed all of those procedures when firing Captain Bennett, didn't you? I enforced the zero-tolerance aspect of our policy. The situation warranted immediate action. Walsh raised an eyebrow. Because the target was your wife. Because a company employee made racist comments to a passenger. Alexander corrected firmly. The relationship is irrelevant to the violation. Irrelevant, Walsh repeated skeptically. Mr. Reynolds, would you have personally boarded that plane if the passenger in question had been a stranger? Gabriella interjected. Objection. Calls for speculation. Walsh smiled thinly. I'll rephrase. Prior to this incident, Mr. Reynolds, how many times had you personally terminated an employee on the spot without following standard procedures? None, Alexander admitted. So, this was unprecedented. The situation was unprecedented. Walsh's smile widened slightly as if Alexander had walked into a trap. Actually, it wasn't. I have here reports of 3 similar incidents in the past 2 years where passengers alleged discriminatory comments by Global Airways staff. In each case, the complaint was processed through normal channels, investigated over several weeks, and resolved without CEO intervention. Can you explain the difference? Alexander kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he cursed the effective research of Walsh's team. I wasn't personally aware of those incidents. Exactly, Walsh pounced. You weren't personally affected. Those incidents didn't involve your wife, so they weren't important enough for your direct intervention. That's not what I said, Alexander countered evenly. Let's be direct, Mr. Reynolds. Walsh continued, leaning forward. You fired Captain Bennett in front of a plane full of witnesses because you were angry that he insulted your wife. This wasn't about company policy. It was about personal revenge. No, Alexander replied firmly. I terminated Bennett because he violated our zero-tolerance policy on discrimination. The fact that I witnessed the aftermath firsthand simply meant I could take immediate action rather than waiting for a report to work its way through bureaucracy. Walsh shifted tactics. Your board chairman, Thomas Whitfield, has expressed concerns about your handling of this situation. In fact, he's indicated that your actions were impulsive and potentially detrimental to the company. How do you respond to that? Thomas is entitled to his opinion, Alexander replied diplomatically. The board as a whole has not formally censured my decision. Not yet, Walsh noted with subtle emphasis. But isn't it true that the board has discussed a vote of no confidence in your leadership because of this incident? Alexander maintained his composure, though the direct reference to private board matters was clearly designed to unsettle him. Board deliberations are confidential. I'll take that as confirmation. Walsh smiled. Now let's discuss Vertex Holdings' stock performance since this incident began. For the next hour, Walsh hammered Alexander on the financial impact of his decision. The stock drop, customer boycotts, negative media coverage, and employee morale issues. Throughout, his underlying narrative remained consistent. Alexander had acted impulsively out of personal anger, violating company procedures and damaging shareholder value in the process. By late afternoon, the deposition had moved to Alexander's personal history with confronting racism. You've made public statements about your commitment to anti-racism, correct? Walsh asked. Yes, Alexander confirmed. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are core values at Vertex, and you've implemented numerous policies aimed at addressing structural barriers for people of color. Yes, we have. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. Would you describe yourself as particularly sensitive to issues of racial justice? Alexander recognized the trap, but answered honestly. I'm committed to creating an equitable workplace and society. I wouldn't characterize that as particularly sensitive, just responsible. Your wife testified that you've been supportive throughout her career as she faced various forms of discrimination. Would you agree with that characterization? Yes, absolutely. And it upsets you when she experiences racism. Of course. Walsh leaned forward slightly. So upset, in fact, that when you heard about Captain Bennett's comments, you abandoned a scheduled meeting with major investors, rushed to the airport, boarded a plane, and fired a 35-year veteran employee on the spot, all within 30 minutes of receiving your wife's text message. That level of immediate visceral reaction suggests an emotional response, not a measured business decision. Wouldn't you agree? Gabriella started to object, but Alexander raised his hand slightly, indicating he wanted to answer. Mr. Walsh, he said, his voice steady, you're attempting to frame decisive action against racism as impulsive emotionality. The implication seems to be that a rational response would have been to proceed slowly through layers of bureaucracy while allowing a racist employee to continue representing our company. I reject that framing entirely. Walsh's expression hardened. The implication, Mr. Reynolds, is that you used your position of power to exact personal vengeance, bypassing established procedures and potentially exposing your company to significant liability, all because someone insulted your wife. The implication is offensive and inaccurate, Alexander replied calmly. Captain Bennett wasn't fired for insulting anyone. He was fired for making explicitly racist comments to a passenger while representing our company. The fact that the passenger happened to be my wife meant I learned about it immediately rather than through a delayed reporting process. Walsh studied Alexander for a moment, perhaps recognizing he wouldn't easily be provoked into an emotional response that could later be used against him. One final question, Mr. Reynolds, Walsh said finally. If you had the opportunity to revisit that day, knowing what you know now about the consequences, the lawsuit, the media attention, the stock drop, the board's concerns, would you still fire Captain Bennett in the same manner? It was a loaded question designed to force Alexander to either admit regret, weakening their position, or appear stubbornly committed to a damaging course of action, reinforcing Walsh's narrative of impulsive leadership. Alexander took a moment before responding, his gaze steady. If I could revisit that day, the only thing I would change would be to have had better systems in place to identify and address Bennett's pattern of behavior before it escalated to the point where he felt comfortable making overtly racist comments to a passenger. The fact that he felt safe doing so represents a failure in our culture that I take full responsibility for addressing. But no, I would not change my decision to enforce our zero-tolerance policy immediately and decisively. Walsh nodded, his expression unreadable. No further questions. As they gathered their belongings after the grueling 2-day deposition, Gabriella looked concerned. They're building a strong narrative around emotional decision-making and procedural violations, she said quietly. Walsh is very good at what he does. He is, Alexander agreed. But so are we. The truth of that assertion would soon be tested as the case moved inexorably toward trial, a public reckoning with far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Imani stood at the bedroom window of their penthouse apartment, gazing at the city lights without really seeing them. It was past midnight, but sleep remained elusive. The depositions had concluded 2 weeks ago, yet their effects lingered like a persistent shadow, altering the dynamics of her marriage in subtle but unmistakable ways. Alexander sat at his desk across the room, illuminated by the blue glow of his laptop screen. He'd been working late every night since his deposition, reviewing legal documents, responding to board inquiries, and managing the ongoing corporate fallout from the lawsuit. Are you coming to bed soon? Imani asked, not turning from the window. Soon, Alexander replied, his attention still fixed on his screen. I need to finish this response to Thomas. The board wants another update on our legal strategy. Imani nodded, though Alexander wasn't looking. This had become their new normal, existing in the same space while occupied with separate aspects of the same all-consuming crisis. She moved away from the window, sitting on the edge of their bed. We haven't really talked, Alexander. Not about anything besides the lawsuit, not for weeks. Alexander finally looked up, the fatigue evident in his face. I know. I'm sorry. It's just... I know, Imani said when he didn't finish. You're trying to save your company while fighting for principle. It's a lot. Alexander closed his laptop and joined her on the bed, taking her hand. How are you? Really? The question, simple as it was, broke something open inside her. I'm not sure anymore, she admitted. I went back to work, but everything feels different. My colleagues are supportive, but there's this undercurrent of, I don't know, caution. Like they're afraid I might shatter if they mention anything related to the case. And your patients? My patients are still my patients. Thank God. Operating is the only time I feel normal, when it's just me and a child's brain and the work that needs to be done. She paused. But even there, I've had 2 families request a different surgeon after recognizing my name from the news. Alexander squeezed her hand. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Isn't it, though? If I hadn't confronted Bennett so publicly... Stop. Imani interrupted firmly. We're not doing this again. Bennett made racist comments. You took appropriate action. Everything that followed was a result of his behavior and his choice to fight rather than accept the consequences. Alexander nodded, but the guilt lingered in his eyes. Thomas called again today. The board is getting more insistent about considering settlement options. What did you tell him? The same thing I've been telling him, that we're proceeding with our defense based on legal merit, not public relations concerns. Imani studied his face. And what did he say to that? Alexander hesitated. He reminded me that as CEO, my primary responsibility is to shareholder value, not personal vindication. Is that how he sees this? As personal vindication. That's how most of the board sees it, Alexander admitted. They acknowledge Bennett's behavior was inappropriate, but they view my response as disproportionate and emotionally driven. In their eyes, I created $1 million problem out of a $1,000 offense. The familiar anger rose in Imani's chest, the rage at having racism reduced to a cost-benefit analysis, at having her humanity treated as a line item in a corporate budget. And what do you think? She asked quietly. Alexander met her gaze directly. I think principles matter. I think standing against racism matters. I think showing our employees and customers that we mean what we say about zero tolerance matters. He paused. But I also think I underestimated the forces that would align against us, the media narrative, the board's priorities, the public's short attention span for moral complexity. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their situation pressing down on them both. Are you having second thoughts? Imani finally asked. About firing Bennett? No, never. Alexander's response was immediate and firm. About how we're handling the aftermath. Sometimes. I wonder if we should have been more strategic, less public. If I should have anticipated Bennett's counter-narrative and prepared for it. Imani nodded slowly. I understand. I have moments of doubt, too. Times when I wonder if this fight is worth what it's costing us, not just financially, but personally. She paused, then asked something that had been on her mind for days. Do you ever resent me for being the catalyst for all this? Alexander looked genuinely shocked. God, no. Never. How could you even think that? Because this is destroying everything you've built, Imani said softly. Your company, your reputation, your relationship with the board, all because Bennett decided to target me. and you decided to defend me." Alexander took both her hands, now turning to face her fully. "Listen to me. You are not responsible for Bennett's racism. You are not responsible for my decision to fire him. And you are certainly not responsible for his lawsuit or the board's reaction. If I lost Vertex tomorrow, it would hurt, yes. But losing you, that would destroy me." The raw emotion in his voice broke through Imani's defenses. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his shoulder as he wrapped his arms around her. "I'm so tired, Alexander," she whispered. "Tired of being strong. Tired of being the brave black woman facing racism. Tired of having my experience debated in depositions and media articles." "I know," he murmured, stroking her back. "I know, and I'm sorry you have to carry this burden." "It is what it is," she said, echoing her grandmother's pragmatic wisdom. "We just keep going." "We keep going," Alexander agreed. "Together." It wasn't a solution to their problems. It didn't resolve the lawsuit or appease the board or silence Bennett's media campaign. But in that moment, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, it was enough to remind them both that whatever external battles they faced, their internal alliance remained unbroken. The headlines seemed to multiply daily, each more sensational than the last billion-dollar battle CEO's crusade against pilot raises questions of power abuse. Reynolds versus Bennett, racial justice or corporate overreach. Vertex Holdings stock tumbles as lawsuit drags on. Imani scrolled through the news alerts on her tablet, each one a fresh reminder of how thoroughly their private lives had been thrust into public view. What had begun as a confrontation over racist comments had morphed into a media spectacle analyzed from every possible angle: legal, corporate, cultural, and personal. Her professional reputation hadn't escaped unscathed. While most coverage acknowledged her impressive medical credentials, there was always an undercurrent of scrutiny, a subtle questioning of her character. Was she truly a victim of racism or a privileged elite who couldn't handle perceived slights? Had she manipulated her husband into a disproportionate response? Was she the catalyst for a corporate crisis that had wiped millions from Vertex's market value? The worst came from anonymous online commenters who dissected every aspect of her appearance, background, and character with vicious precision. They analyzed photos of her hairstyle from that day, debating whether Bennett's jungle comparison had any objective basis. They questioned whether her medical career had been advanced through merit or affirmative action. They speculated about her marriage, her motivations, and her mental stability. Even at the hospital where she had once found sanctuary in her work, the case followed her. Administrators had expressed concerns about negative publicity affecting donor relations. Fellow surgeons were supportive but distracted by the constant questions from patients and staff. Residents who had once approached her easily now seemed uncertain, as if her involvement in a high-profile lawsuit had somehow altered her identity as their mentor. One morning, as Imani prepared for rounds, the department administrator, Dr. Helen Crawford, knocked on her office door. "Imani, do you have a moment?" "Of course, Helen. What is it?" Crawford closed the door behind her, her expression concerned. "We've had another request from a patient's family to transfer to a different surgeon. The Ramirez case." Imani felt a familiar weight settle in her stomach. The Ramirez child was scheduled for a complex procedure, exactly the type of challenging case that had once been her specialty. Did they say why she asked, though she already knew the answer? "They mentioned concerns about your focus given the ongoing lawsuit publicity," Crawford said delicately. "I tried to reassure them, but they were quite insistent." Imani nodded, maintaining her professional composure despite the sting. "That's their prerogative. Please transfer the case to Dr. Patel. He's well equipped to handle it." "This is the third case in 2 weeks," Imani Crawford noted gently. "I'm concerned about the pattern." "So am I," Imani admitted. But what would you suggest? I can't abandon the lawsuit to appease worried parents. No, of course not, Crawford agreed. But perhaps a temporary reduction in your surgical schedule. Focus more on research and supervision until this situation resolves. The suggestion, however well-intentioned, felt like another victory for Bennett. His racist comments were now affecting not just her personal life, but her professional practice, limiting her ability to do the work that defined her. I'll consider it, Imani said, finally, unwilling to make a decision while emotions ran high. Crawford nodded clearly, relieved to have completed an uncomfortable conversation. For what it's worth, the department stands behind you completely. We know the kind of surgeon and person you are. Thank you, Helen. That means a lot. After Crawford left, Imani sat alone in her office contemplating the widening circles of impact from that single moment on the plane. The consequences had expanded beyond anything she could have anticipated affecting her marriage, her career, Alexander's company, and now even her patients. Just then there was another knock at her door. When she called for the person to enter, she was surprised to see Dr. James Williams, one of the hospital's few black attending physicians. James. What can I do for you, Williams? A cardiologist in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a gentle manner closed the door behind him. I heard about the Ramirez transfer. Word travels fast around here. Imani sighed. Of course it does. I wanted to check on you, Williams said, sitting across from her. This isn't just professional courtesy, it's solidarity. I've been watching what you're going through with this lawsuit, and it's familiar. Familiar, Imani asked. Williams nodded. 10 years ago, I filed a discrimination complaint against the previous chief of cardiology. It wasn't as public as your situation, but within these walls it was explosive. Suddenly, colleagues were concerned about my focus. Patients requested transfers. Administration suggested I take a temporary step back. What did you do? Imani asked, leaning forward. I doubled down, Williams said with a small smile. Took on the most difficult cases published, more research, mentored more residents. Made myself too valuable to sideline. It wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to quit. Days I wondered if the fight was worth it. But I refused to let them push me out. And now I'm on the hospital board, Williams said. And the chief who discriminated against me is gone. It took years, but eventually competence outlasted prejudice. Imani felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected alliance. Thank you for telling me this. It helps to know I'm not the first to walk this path. You're definitely not, Williams assured her. And you're not walking it alone. The Black Physicians Association is planning a public statement of support. We've been waiting for the right moment. This gesture meant more to Imani than Williams could know a concrete counterweight to the anonymous online hate and institutional caution. That would be incredibly meaningful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Williams nodded. It's the least we can do. What you and your husband are doing standing firm against racism when it would be easier to settle and move on matters beyond this one case. It sets a precedent. After Williams left, Imani's phone chimed with a text message from Alexander. Security team intercepted another threat. Nothing credible, but they've increased patrols at the apartment. Don't worry, just protocol. Imani closed her eyes briefly. The threats had begun 2 weeks ago, angry messages from Bennett supporters calling her a race baiter and Alexander a corporate tyrant. Most were merely offensive, but a few had crossed into threatening territory, necessitating increased security measures at their home and workplaces. She typed back, "Thanks for letting me know. Stay safe. Love you." As she prepared to leave for rounds, Imani caught sight of her reflection in the office window. She looked tired, the strain of the past months visible in the shadows under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. But her posture remained straight, her gaze steady. Bennett's comments had lasted less than a minute. The aftermath was stretching into eternity. Yet, despite everything, the professional setbacks, the public scrutiny, the strain on her marriage, Imani couldn't bring herself to regret standing against racism. Some principles were worth the cost, however high. With that thought firmly in mind, she straightened her white coat and headed out to care for her remaining patients. The Vertex Holdings boardroom was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Alexander sat alone at the head of the long mahogany table, reviewing documents for the upcoming emergency board meeting. The expansive windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city spread out like a glittering tapestry beneath the afternoon sun. The door opened and Thomas Whitfield entered. At 65, he carried himself with the confident authority of old money and established power. His tailored suit and precisely knotted tie projected an image of traditional corporate leadership, stability, predictability, risk aversion. Alexander. He greeted, closing the door behind him. "Thank you for meeting privately before the full board arrives." Alexander rose, extending his hand. "Thomas, I assumed you wanted to coordinate our approach for the meeting." Whitfield's handshake was brief, his expression grave. In a manner of speaking, yes. He took a seat adjacent to Alexander, rather than his usual position at the opposite end of the table, a subtle indication that this was to be a more personal conversation. "The board has reached a decision," Alexander Whitfield began without preamble. "We've reviewed the financial impact of the Bennett situation, consulted with outside counsel, and spoken with major shareholders. We've concluded that this lawsuit must be settled immediately." Alexander's expression remained neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. "The board can recommend a settlement, Thomas, but as CEO, litigation strategy falls under my operational authority." Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "Don't be obtuse, Alexander. You know perfectly well the board can direct you to settle, or we can replace you with someone who will." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality," Whitfield countered. "Vertex's stock has dropped 17 points since this began. We've lost over $1 billion in market value. Customer boycotts have reduced Global Airways bookings by 12%. 3 institutional investors have expressed grave concerns about leadership stability, all of which are temporary reactions to a manufactured media narrative," Alexander argued. "Bennett's lawsuit is legally weak. Gabriella believes we'll prevail at trial. At what cost?" Whitfield demanded. "Another year of litigation, millions in legal fees, and ongoing brand damage, all for what? To prove you were right to fire an employee in a manner that violated our own procedures." Alexander leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "To demonstrate that our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination isn't just words on paper. To show our employees and customers that racism has consequences regardless of seniority or position." Whitfield sighed heavily. "Noble principles, Alexander. But you weren't elected to a moral crusade. You were hired to maximize shareholder value. Right now, you're failing at that primary responsibility: short-term stock fluctuations." "This isn't about short-term fluctuations," Whitfield interrupted sharply. "It's about your judgment. You allowed a personal matter to cloud your professional decision-making. You created this crisis through impulsive action, and you've prolonged it through stubborn refusal to consider settlement." Alexander studied Whitfield's face, recognizing the resolved set of his jaw. "What exactly is the board proposing?" "We're directing you to settle the lawsuit," Whitfield stated flatly. "Offer Bennett $2 million with a mutual non-disclosure agreement. End this circus immediately." $2 million, Alexander repeated incredulously. "You want to pay a man $2 million for making racist comments. We want to pay $2 million to protect $1 billion in market value," Whitfield corrected. "It's simple mathematics. And what about the message it sends?" Alexander challenged. "What about the black employees watching to see if we actually enforce our anti-discrimination policies? What about the passengers who have experienced similar treatment? What about my wife, whose dignity you're asking me to price at $2 million? Whitfield's expression softened slightly. I understand this is personal for you, Alexander, but as CEO you cannot afford personal indulgences. Your obligation is to the company. Alexander stood pacing to the window. The city below continued its bustling rhythm, oblivious to the corporate drama unfolding above. And if I refuse? He asked finally. Whitfield's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. Then the board will call for a vote of no confidence at today's meeting. Based on my conversations with other directors, that vote will pass. You'll be asked to resign, and if you refuse, you'll be removed. The ultimatum hung in the air between them. Alexander had built Vertex Holdings from a modest investment firm into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. It was more than his livelihood. It was his legacy, his life's work. And now he was being forced to choose between that legacy and his principles. You're asking me to betray my wife, Alexander said quietly, to validate Bennett's narrative that his comments weren't serious enough to warrant termination. I'm asking you to fulfill your fiduciary duty, Whitfield replied. Your personal feelings, and yes, your wife's feelings, must be secondary to the company's interests. Alexander turned back from the window, his decision crystallizing. I need to speak with Imani before responding to the board's directive. Whitfield nodded, rising from his seat. The meeting begins in 2 hours. I need your answer before then. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, Alexander, I respect your commitment to principle. But a public company CEO doesn't have the luxury of putting principle above pragmatism, not at this scale. After Whitfield departed, Alexander sat alone in the silent boardroom, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Everything he'd built over 20 years hung in the balance. And somewhere across town, Bennett and his attorney were likely celebrating, knowing that corporate pressure might accomplish what legal merit could not. Alexander picked up his phone and dialed Imani's number. This was a decision they needed to make together, whatever the consequences might be. Imani arrived at Alexander's office 40 minutes later, her face tense with concern. He'd said little on the phone, only that the board had delivered an ultimatum and they needed to talk immediately. Tell me everything, she said as soon as the door closed behind her. Alexander recounted his conversation with Whitfield. The settlement demand, the threatened vote of no confidence, the 2-hour deadline for his decision. They'd actually remove you as CEO? Imani asked, disbelief coloring her voice despite having anticipated this possibility for weeks. They can and they will, Alexander confirmed grimly. Whitfield has the votes. Imani paced the office, her mind racing. This is exactly what Bennett wanted to make us pay, literally and figuratively. It's not about Bennett anymore, Alexander noted. It's about corporate governance, shareholder value, and my judgment as CEO. It's about racism, Imani countered sharply. It's always been about racism. Everything else is just corporate window dressing for the same old pattern, prioritizing profit over people, comfort over confrontation. Alexander didn't disagree. He watched his wife pace, recognizing the familiar signs of her processing complex problems, the same expression she wore when planning difficult surgeries. What are you thinking? He asked finally. Imani stopped pacing, turning to face him directly. I'm thinking that we're at a crossroads and there are no good options. She took a deep breath. If you refuse to settle, you lose your company. If you agree to settle, Bennett walks away with millions and a vindication of sorts. That's about the size of it. What do you want to do? She asked. Alexander leaned back in his chair, running a hand across his face. Professionally speaking, settlement is the rational choice. It ends the litigation, stops the stock slide, and allows the company to move forward. But personally, it feels like surrender. Like telling Bennett and everyone watching that racism isn't serious enough to risk profits over. Imani nodded, understanding the conflict all too well. It mirrored her own internal struggle between pragmatism and principle. There's a third option, she said suddenly. Alexander looked up, curious. What's that? You could resign. The suggestion hung in the air between them, unexpected yet compelling. Think about it, Imani continued. If you resign before the board forces you out, you control the narrative. You can publicly state that you're stepping down because the board prioritizes financial considerations over confronting racism. You make it clear that you're choosing principle over position. It would be career suicide, Alexander observed, though not dismissively. No public company would hire a CEO who resigned rather than settle a lawsuit. Would that be so terrible? Imani asked quietly. You've achieved more than most executives dream of. You've built incredible wealth. Maybe this is the moment to redefine success. Alexander considered the possibility, turning it over in his mind. What about you? Your career has already been affected. If I resign in protest, the spotlight on us both will intensify. My career is important to me, Imani acknowledged, but not as important as living with integrity, not as important as being able to look at myself in the mirror each morning. She sat beside him, taking his hands in hers. When I was in medical school, my grandmother told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "There are two kinds of success in this world. There's the kind that builds your bank account, and there's the kind that builds your soul. If you can have both, wonderful. But if you must choose, always choose your soul. You can live without money, but you cannot truly live without integrity." The tension that had been building between them for weeks, the strain of public scrutiny, legal pressure, and difficult choices seemed to dissipate as they found themselves once again on the same side, facing the world together, rather than struggling separately. Alexander squeezed her hands. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She was, Imani agreed, and she would be proud of you for even considering this choice. Alexander stood moving to where Imani stood by the window. He took both her hands in his expression resolute. We could start something new, a foundation focused on combating discrimination in corporate environments. Use our experience to create real change. We could, Imani agreed, a small smile breaking through her concern. Lose the battle but win the war in a sense. The board wants an answer in less than an hour, Alexander noted, glancing at his watch. If I'm going to resign, I'll need to prepare a statement. Are you sure this is what you want? Imani asked, searching his face. Vertex has been your life for 20 years. Alexander's response was measured but certain. Vertex is a company. You are my life, and the principles we stand for define who we are. He squeezed her hands. I'm sure. As they began drafting Alexander's resignation statement, both felt a surprising sense of liberation. The path ahead was uncertain, the costs significant, but the burden of compromise had been lifted. Whatever came next, they would face it together with their integrity intact. For the first time since Bennett's racist comments on that fateful flight, they weren't just reacting to events, they were choosing their own course, reclaiming agency in a situation that had spiraled beyond their control. It wasn't a perfect solution, but in an imperfect world, it was the one they could live with. The conference room at Morales & Associates was meticulously neutral. No corporate logos, no personal touches, just sleek furniture and subtle lighting designed to create an atmosphere of professional detachment. It was a space built for the delicate dance of legal compromise. Alexander sat beside Gabriela Morales, his expression composed despite the turmoil of the past 24 hours. Across the table, Martin Walsh and Richard Bennett waited, the former radiating confident expectation, the latter struggling to conceal his smug satisfaction. Between them sat Judge Eleanor Montgomery, a respected retired jurist who had agreed to mediate the settlement discussions. Her silver hair and penetrating gaze conveyed decades of experience cutting through legal posturing to find practical solutions. Gentlemen, Judge Montgomery began, We're here to resolve the matter of Bennett v. Reynolds and Vertex Holdings without further litigation. Both parties have expressed willingness to discuss settlement terms. She turned to Walsh. Counselor, please outline your client's position. Walsh straightened his tie, the picture of reasonable professionalism. Your Honor, Captain Bennett has suffered tremendous professional and personal harm as a result of his wrongful termination. His 35-year career was ended abruptly and publicly, causing both financial loss and reputational damage. He has been unable to secure comparable employment in the aviation industry. The emotional distress has been severe. He slid a document across the table. We propose a settlement of $5 million in compensatory damages, plus reinstatement to his former position with back pay and benefits, and a public acknowledgement from Vertex Holdings that proper termination procedures were not followed. Gabriella received the document without reaction, though Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ms. Morales, Judge Montgomery prompted. With respect, Your Honor, Gabriella began. Mr. Walsh's proposal is detached from reality. The settlement amount is grossly inflated, and reinstatement is simply not an option. Captain Bennett made racist comments to a passenger while in uniform, violating our zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. She produced her own document. Our counteroffer is $1 million in exchange for mutual non-disparagement agreements and full confidentiality regarding the terms of settlement. No reinstatement, no public statement beyond acknowledging the matter has been resolved. Walsh scoffed. $1 million for a 35-year career, absurd. $1 million for making racist comments and then suing when held accountable, Gabriella countered smoothly. Some might call that generous. Judge Montgomery raised a hand to forestall further argument. Let's focus on finding middle ground. Captain Bennett, would you be willing to remove the reinstatement demand in exchange for increased financial compensation? Bennett glanced at Walsh, who nodded slightly. I would consider it, Bennett said reluctantly. But the financial settlement would need to reflect the permanence of my career loss. Bennett's voice carried none of the humility he displayed in his media appearances. Here, in the privacy of settlement negotiations, his true demeanor emerged, entitled, aggrieved and calculating. Mr. Reynolds, the judge continued, would Vertex be willing to increase the settlement amount if all demands for reinstatement and public statements were dropped? Alexander paused before responding, his expression revealing nothing of the internal conflict he'd been navigating since his confrontation with the board. Vertex Holdings is prepared to be reasonable about the financial terms provided strict confidentiality is maintained. Judge Montgomery nodded, seemingly satisfied with the initial positioning. Let's take a brief recess for private consultations, then reconvene to discuss specific numbers. As Bennett and Walsh stepped out, Gabriella turned to Alexander. The board authorized up to $2 million, she reminded him quietly. But we should start lower and work up to it. Alexander nodded absently, his attention on Bennett's retreating figure. The pilot walked with the stiff dignity of a man clinging to righteous indignation, but there was something else in his posture, a satisfaction that suggested he already considered this a victory regardless of the final number. Alexander, Gabriella prompted, noting his distraction. I heard you, he assured her. Start low, settle at $2 million if necessary. Are you still planning to resign afterward? She asked, her voice dropping further. Yes. The board's ultimatum was clear. Settle or face removal. I'm settling as directed, but I won't continue to lead a company whose values no longer align with mine. Gabriella studied him for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Both choices actually settling to protect the company's interests and resigning to protect your integrity. Thank you, Alexander replied simply. That means a lot coming from you. When negotiations resumed, the expected haggling over numbers began in earnest. Walsh started at $4 million with a strongly worded letter acknowledging procedural errors. Gabriella countered with $1.2 million and no letter. The figures slowly converged as Judge Montgomery skillfully guided the process. By late afternoon, they had reached the critical moment. Judge Montgomery summarized the tentative agreement, $2.5 million to Captain Bennett, mutual non-disparagement and confidentiality agreements for all parties, and a joint statement acknowledging only that the matter has been resolved to both parties' satisfaction. Is this acceptable? Walsh conferred briefly with Bennett, then nodded. We accept these terms, Your Honor. Vertex Holdings accepts as well. Gabriella confirmed after a glance at Alexander. Excellent Judge Montgomery said with evident relief. I'll leave you to finalize the documentation. Congratulations on reaching a resolution. As the judge departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Bennett stared at Alexander with undisguised contempt. Was it worth it, Reynolds? All this drama just to end up paying me anyway? Alexander met his gaze evenly. The cost of confronting racism is always worth it, Captain Bennett, even when the immediate outcome isn't what we hoped for. Bennett's face flushed with anger. You self-righteous Captain Walsh interrupted sharply. Remember the non-disparagement clause we just agreed to. Bennett subsided, though his expression remained venomous. Fine. Enjoy writing that check, Reynolds. I certainly plan to enjoy spending it. Alexander stood gathering his documents with deliberate calm. Ms. Morales will handle the final paperwork. I have nothing further to say to you, Captain Bennett. As Alexander left the conference room, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Disappointment at the necessary compromise, relief that the legal battle was ending, and a strange sense of liberation, knowing that his resignation would soon free him from the corporate constraints that had forced this settlement. Bennett had won a Pyrrhic victory financial compensation at the cost of his career and reputation. Alexander had lost a battle but preserved the option to continue the larger war on his own terms. Neither man was truly satisfied, which perhaps was the nature of settlement and arrangement where everyone sacrifices something to avoid the greater uncertainty of continued conflict. The joint statement was a masterpiece of corporate ambiguity, carefully crafted to say nothing while appearing to say something. Global Airways, a subsidiary of Vertex Holdings, and Captain Richard Bennett announced that they have reached a mutually satisfactory resolution to all matters between them. The terms of the resolution are confidential. Both parties consider this matter closed and will have no further comment. The statement was released simultaneously on Vertex's corporate website and through Bennett's attorney. It appeared as a minor news item in aviation industry publications and received brief mentions in business sections of major newspapers. Most reports noted the settlement without speculating on the amount, though several mentioned industry sources, suggesting it was in the low millions. Alexander read the coverage with detached interest from his office, where he was clearing out personal items in preparation for his resignation announcement. The board had been informed of his decision that morning, a courtesy rather than a request for reconsideration. Thomas Whitfield had received the news with a mixture of surprise and something resembling respect. You're actually resigning, even after agreeing to the settlement. The settlement satisfies the board's immediate concerns, Alexander had explained. My resignation addresses the longer-term issue of fundamental disagreement about corporate values and leadership priorities. Whitfield had seemed genuinely perplexed. You're giving up everything you've built because we insisted on a pragmatic resolution to a legal problem I'm choosing to lead differently, Alexander had corrected him. Just not from the CEO's office at Vertex. Now, as he packed books and photographs into a cardboard box, Alexander reflected on the carefully worded resignation statement Imani had helped him craft. Unlike the bland settlement announcement, his personal statement would be direct and honest. After 20 years building and leading Vertex Holdings, I am stepping down as CEO. While this decision coincides with the resolution of recent litigation, it stems from a deeper recognition corporate leadership requires alignment between personal values and institutional priorities. When those diverge significantly, integrity demands change rather than compromise. I remain proud of what we've built at Vertex, and grateful for the dedicated team that made it possible. I look forward to applying the lessons of my corporate experience to new ventures focused on creating workplaces where dignity, equality, and respect are never subordinated to financial expedience. The statement was scheduled for release tomorrow morning, after which Alexander would address Vertex employees directly before departing. It would trigger another round of media speculation, and likely a temporary dip in the company's stock price, but those concerns were no longer his responsibility. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Whitfield is here to see you," she announced. Alexander nodded, surprised. He hadn't expected another conversation with the board chairman before his departure. Whitfield entered, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. He glanced at the half-packed box on Alexander's desk, but made no comment about it. "The settlement paperwork is complete," he said instead. Bennett's attorney confirmed receipt of the wire transfer. "Good," Alexander replied simply. "That chapter is closed." Whitfield shifted his weight, clearly building to something more significant than a settlement update. "The board has been discussing your resignation." "There's nothing to discuss, Thomas. My decision is final." "I understand that," Whitfield said, raising a hand. "This isn't an attempt to change your mind. It's about context." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Context. Your resignation statement mentions a divergence between personal values and institutional priorities," Whitfield said carefully. "That characterization could be interpreted as a condemnation of the board and the company you built." "It's a statement of fact, not condemnation," Alexander replied. "We disagreed about how to handle Bennett's lawsuit. That disagreement revealed a fundamental difference in values." Whitfield nodded slowly. "The board respects your decision to resign based on principle. What I'm asking personally is that you consider the impact of how you frame that resignation on the company you've built and the employees who remain." It was a fair point, Alexander had to admit. His resignation would affect thousands of people who had nothing to do with Bennett or the board's ultimatum. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "A joint statement," Whitfield suggested. "One that acknowledges your decision to pursue new ventures while expressing mutual respect and appreciation for your leadership. No mention of value conflicts or compromised principles." Alexander considered the request. It would certainly be easier for the company a clean transition narrative rather than a public airing of philosophical differences. But it would also obscure the real reason for his departure, diluting the statement he wanted to make about corporate accountability. "I appreciate your concern, Thomas," he said finally, "but I won't release a statement that misrepresents my reasons for leaving. That said, I'm willing to focus on the future, rather than dwelling on our disagreements. I'll revise the language to emphasize my new direction without explicitly criticizing the board's approach to the Bennett situation." Whitfield seemed to recognize this was the most he would get. "Thank you. That's reasonable." As Whitfield turned to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Alexander, I think you're making a mistake. But I respect your willingness to sacrifice position for principle. It's rare in our world." After Whitfield departed, Alexander returned to packing, reflecting on the irony of the situation. The carefully worded settlement statement had hidden the truth for corporate convenience. His resignation statement would reveal at least some of that truth despite corporate pressure to maintain the facade. The next morning, when both statements had been released, the contrast would be clear to anyone paying attention: institutional language designed to obscure versus personal conviction willing to disrupt. It wasn't a perfect victory against the forces that had protected Bennett, but it was something a refusal to participate in the system that valued appearance over accountability. Richard Bennett sat alone on his patio nursing a scotch as he watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The check had cleared that morning $2.5 million, minus his attorney's substantial contingency fee. Still, it was more money than he had ever possessed at one time, enough to ensure comfortable retirement, despite his abrupt career termination. On paper, it was a victory. He had challenged a billionaire CEO and walked away with millions. His attorney called it a textbook example of standing up to corporate overreach. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing on his part, no acknowledgement that his comments had been racist or inappropriate. Yet as Bennett swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the triumph felt hollow. The non-disclosure agreement prevented him from discussing the settlement, publicly cutting short his media tour and silencing the platform he had briefly enjoyed. His reputation in the aviation industry remained tarnished. No airline would touch him now, regardless of the financial resolution. Bennett had never expected this outcome when he approached Imani Carter Reynolds that day on the plane. It had been a momentary indulgence, the kind of casual put-down he'd delivered countless times to passengers who didn't match his idea of first-class clientele. Usually the targets of his comments stayed quiet, perhaps complained to a flight attendant who would offer platitudes but take no action. The system had always protected him before. His father's words echoed in his mind. "The world's changing, Richie. They're letting all kinds of people into places they don't belong. But real authority, the kind you'll have as a captain, can't be questioned." Those words, spoken decades ago when Bennett was beginning flight training, had shaped his worldview. His father had lost his own piloting career during the industry's early diversity initiatives, forever embittering him against what he called quota hires and political correctness. Bennett had absorbed that resentment, carrying it through his career like a hidden badge of honor. Never had he imagined that a casual racist comment would end his career and drag his name through the public arena. The settlement money was substantial, but the cost to his identity had been devastating. For 35 years he had been Captain Bennett. Now he was just Richard, a man with a tarnished reputation and too much time on his hands. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Alexander Reynolds resigns as Vertex Holdings CEO. Bennett opened the article, scanning it quickly. Reynolds's resignation statement made no direct reference to the lawsuit, but the timing and phrasing left little doubt about the connection. Corporate leadership requires alignment between personal values and institutional priorities. When those diverge significantly, integrity demands change rather than compromise. Bennett scowled, downing the remainder of his scotch in one bitter swallow. Even in apparent defeat, Reynolds had found a way to claim moral victory, positioning himself as a man of principle who chose resignation over compromised values. The media was already spinning the narrative that way. Financial analysts speculated about Reynolds's next venture, with many predicting he would launch a foundation or investment firm focused on corporate ethics and inclusion. His public image was transforming from embattled CEO to principled leader, sacrificing position for conviction. Bennett, meanwhile, sat alone with his money and his silence barred by legal agreement from defending himself or challenging Reynolds's characterization of events. The settlement that had seemed like vindication now felt like a clever trap he had been bought off and muzzled, while Reynolds emerged with his reputation not just intact, but enhanced. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from a former colleague at Global Airways. "Heard the news about Reynolds? Guess you won after all." Bennett didn't respond. What could he say? That his victory felt like ashes in his mouth. That he had traded a lifetime of professional respect for a one-time payment and perpetual notoriety. That everywhere he went in his industry he would forever be that pilot who made racist comments and then sued when held accountable. He poured another scotch larger this time. The sun had nearly disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with deepening purple. Like his career, the day was ending not with the blaze of glory he had imagined when filing the lawsuit, but with a gradual fading into darkness. The memory of his father's funeral came to him unbidden. The old man had died bitter and alone, still raging against the changing world that had taken his wings. Bennett had promised himself he wouldn't end up the same way. Yet here he was following the same path, wealthy but isolated, defined by resentment rather than achievement. For a brief, uncomfortable moment, Bennett considered whether his father's worldview, and by extension his own, had been fundamentally flawed. Was it possible that his sense of entitlement to judge and diminish others based on their appearance wasn't the natural order, but merely inherited prejudice? He pushed the thought away. It was easier to blame Reynolds, to blame political correctness, to blame anything but his own choices and beliefs. Self-reflection was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his entire identity depended on believing he was the victim rather than the aggressor. The $2.5 million would ensure he never wanted for material comforts. But it couldn't buy back his reputation, his sense of identity as a respected pilot, or the colleagues who now avoided his calls. It couldn't erase the reality that his legacy would forever be tainted by that moment on the plane, when he had chosen cruelty over professionalism. Bennett had won the battle for compensation but lost the war for vindication. And somewhere across town, he suspected Imani and Alexander Reynolds were moving forward with clear consciences and new purpose, unburdened by the compromise that had left him wealthy but diminished. It was in every sense that truly mattered an empty victory. 3 months after the settlement and his resignation from Vertex Holdings, Alexander sat in a sunlit office reviewing incorporation documents for the Reynolds Foundation for Workplace Dignity. The foundation's mission to combat discrimination in corporate environments through education policy development and legal support had emerged from his and Imani's experiences during the Bennett confrontation. "These look good," he told the attorney seated across from him. "Let's proceed with the filing." As the attorney gathered the documents, Alexander gazed out the window at the New York skyline. The view was different from his old CEO office, less panoramic, more focused, but the change felt right. The past quarter had been transformative, a period of reflection and redirection that had clarified his purpose in ways the corporate treadmill never could have. His phone chimed with a message from Imani. "Just finished meeting with Martinez family. Surgery scheduled for next week. Dinner at 7. Alexander smiled as he replied, "Perfect. Good news here too. Foundation papers ready to file. See you at 7. Imani had weathered her own professional challenges in the wake of the Bennett settlement and Alexander's resignation. There had been a brief period of intensified media attention, a few more patient transfers, and whispered concerns about controversy affecting the hospital's reputation. But as public interest in the case faded, her sterling surgical record and research contributions had reasserted their primacy. More importantly, she had reclaimed her narrative. The interview with Sarah Matthews of National Public Media, postponed during litigation, but conducted after the settlement, had allowed her to speak candidly about experiencing racism and the toll of having that experience questioned and minimized. The response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with many viewers and listeners expressing appreciation for her dignified resilience in the face of both Bennett's comments and the subsequent legal battle. Alexander's resignation had similarly shifted from perceived corporate scandal to a case study in principled leadership. Several prestigious universities had invited him to speak to business ethics classes. A major publisher had expressed interest in a book about his experiences. Even Thomas Whitfield had reached out with grudging acknowledgement that Vertex's stock had stabilized after an initial drop, suggesting the resignation had not been the catastrophe the board had feared. But the most significant development had emerged unexpectedly from a source neither Alexander nor Imani had anticipated. The knock on his office door interrupted Alexander's reflections. "Your two-Huzro appointment is here," his assistant announced. "Send her in," Alexander replied, standing to greet his visitor. Sophie Winters entered hesitantly, looking both nervous and determined. Since that fateful flight, the young flight attendant had shown remarkable courage, providing a detailed statement for the legal case despite pressure from colleagues to remain silent, and now agreeing to consult on the Foundation's training programs. "Ms. Winters, thank you for coming." Alexander greeted her warmly. "Please have a seat." "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Reynolds," Sophie replied, settling into a chair. "And please call me Sophie." "Sophie it is, and I'm Alexander." He resumed his seat. "I understand you've brought something to share." Sophie nodded, removing a folder from her bag. "After your resignation announcement, several Global Airways employees reached out to me privately. They'd experienced or witnessed similar incidents but never reported them because they didn't believe anything would change. She slid the folder across the desk. These are their stories, anonymized for privacy, but detailed enough to establish patterns. Alexander opened the folder, scanning the first few pages. Each account described discriminatory behavior by senior staff toward passengers or junior employees, particularly people of color. The specificity and consistency of the reports were striking and damning. "This is significant," he said, finally looking up. "Have you shared this with anyone at Global Airways or Vertex?" "No," Sophie admitted. After how the Bennett case was handled, many didn't trust the corporate channels. When they heard about your foundation, they thought you might actually do something with the information. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander. His forced resignation, intended by the board as damage control, had positioned him as a trusted advocate for those still within the system. Free from corporate constraints, he could now address the very issues that had been subordinated to financial considerations during the Bennett lawsuit. "We absolutely will," he assured her. "These accounts will help us design targeted interventions and identify trouble spots in corporate culture. The Foundation's first initiative is developing confidential reporting systems that bypass traditional power structures." Sophie nodded, visibly relieved. "That's exactly what's needed. Most of these incidents go unreported because the reporting channels run through the very people causing the problems." They spent the next hour discussing practical approaches to creating safer workplaces, training programs, policy adjustments, and accountability measures that could prevent future incidents like the one with Bennett. Sophie's frontline perspective proved invaluable, grounding Alexander's broader vision in practical realities. As their meeting concluded, Sophie hesitated before asking, "How is Dr. Carter Reynolds?" "I still feel terrible about not speaking up immediately when Captain Bennett made those comments." "She's doing well," Alexander replied. "And please don't blame yourself. You were in an impossible position. When you did speak up during the investigation, it made a significant difference." "I wish I'd been braver sooner," Sophie said quietly. "Courage takes different forms at different times," Alexander observed. "What matters is that you found yours." After Sophie departed, Alexander returned to the window, watching the afternoon light play across the city. The Foundation was taking shape not just as an organization, but as a movement gathering stories and supporters from unexpected quarters. It wouldn't erase what had happened with Bennett, but it might prevent similar incidents for others. That evening, when Alexander shared Sophie's visit and the collected accounts with Imani over dinner, her reaction was measured but hopeful. "It's validation in a way," she noted. "Proof that what happened to me wasn't isolated but part of a larger pattern. A pattern we can help disrupt," Alexander added. Imani reached across the table to take his hand, her expression softening. "I've been meaning to tell you something. Dr. Williams, you remember the cardiologist who supported me during the worst of the media coverage?" Alexander nodded. "Of course. He approached me yesterday about establishing a joint medical legal clinic for healthcare workers experiencing discrimination. The hospital foundation is willing to provide initial funding." Alexander's face lit up. "Imani, that's fantastic. It would be a natural partner to your foundation," she continued. "Your focus on corporate environments, mine on healthcare settings. Different contexts, same fundamental issues. Perfect alignment," Alexander agreed. "Like us," Imani smiled. "Always." She raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To transformation. Finding purpose even in painful experiences." As they clinked glasses, both recognized how profoundly their lives had changed since that moment on the plane. They had lost battles, but gained clarity. They had sacrificed position, but reclaimed purpose. And, most importantly, they had refused to let Bennett's racism define them or determine their response to the world. The settlement had been a necessary compromise. Alexander's resignation had been a principled stand. But this, the foundation, the shared mission, the ongoing work of creating change, this was the real victory. The inaugural event for the Reynolds Foundation for Workplace Dignity took place exactly 1 year after the incident on Global Airways Flight 835. The timing was deliberate, a reclaiming of the date, transforming it from a painful anniversary into a launch point for positive change. The venue was filled beyond capacity with attendees ranging from corporate executives to frontline workers, legal experts to social justice advocates. Many had experienced workplace discrimination firsthand. Others were committed to preventing it in organizations they led or influenced. Alexander stood at the podium, surveying the diverse audience with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. "What brings us together is a simple but powerful conviction that dignity in the workplace is not a luxury or an afterthought, but a fundamental right." From her seat in the front row, Imani watched her husband with pride. The past year had been challenging but ultimately transformative for them both. Alexander had channeled his corporate expertise into building an organization that was already making tangible differences. Imani had expanded her advocacy work while maintaining her surgical practice, using her platform to highlight discrimination in healthcare settings. 1 year ago, Alexander continued a racist incident on an airplane, set in motion a series of events that led to this foundation. But what we're celebrating today isn't that initial confrontation, it's the constructive response that grew from it. He gestured toward a large screen displaying the Foundation's first-year accomplishments, a legal defense fund that had supported 27 employees facing workplace discrimination, a corporate training program adopted by 17 companies, policy reform initiatives in 3 major industries, and a confidential reporting system that had documented over 300 previously unreported incidents. Each of these numbers represents real people, real experiences, and real change, Alexander emphasized. People like Sophie Winters, who found her voice and helped others find theirs. Sophie, now the Foundation's Director of Outreach, stood for brief acknowledgement. Her confidence a striking contrast to the nervous flight attendant of a year ago. And people like Marco Diaz-Alexander continued, whose case against transcontinental shipping became our legal fund's first victory. Diaz, a warehouse supervisor who had been fired after reporting racist behavior by a manager, raised his hand in recognition as applause filled the room. His reinstatement with full back pay had established an important precedent for the Foundation's approach to legal advocacy. As Alexander outlined the Foundation's plans for the coming year, expanding into international markets, launching a certification program for inclusive workplaces, and partnering with law schools to train the next generation of workplace rights attorneys, Imani reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. Richard Bennett had received his settlement as stipulated by the non-disclosure agreement. Neither she nor Alexander could discuss the specific amount publicly. But the terms had included no restriction on how the money could be used afterward. In a decision that had brought them both profound satisfaction, Alexander had anonymously donated an equal amount, $2.5 million, to seed the Foundation's legal defense fund. It meant that every dollar Bennett had received in settlement was now working to fight the very behavior he had exhibited and denied. His victory was funding justice for others facing discrimination. The symmetry felt right, a form of poetic restitution that no court could have ordered. When Alexander concluded his remarks and opened the floor for questions, a young attorney stood first. "Mr. Reynolds, do you regret how the original incident with Captain Bennett was handled? Would you do anything differently, knowing what you know now?" It was the question journalists had asked repeatedly over the past year, always hoping for an admission of regret or second thoughts that would make for a compelling headline. Alexander's response was measured but clear. "I regret that we live in a world where confronting racism often costs more than perpetrating it. I regret that corporate structures frequently prioritize procedures over people and profits over principles. But I do not regret standing against discrimination, even when that stand came with consequences." He paused, his gaze moving briefly to Imani before continuing. "As for doing things differently, yes, absolutely. With the benefit of hindsight, I would have implemented stronger reporting systems and accountability measures long before that flight. I would have created a culture where Captain Bennett's behavior would have been addressed the first time it occurred, not after years of similar incidents going unreported. The young attorney nodded, seemingly satisfied with the response. As the Q&A session continued, Imani found herself reflecting on Bennett himself. Last they'd heard, he had moved to Arizona and was living quietly on his settlement money. His attempts to remain in aviation had failed. No airline would hire him despite his technical qualifications. His brief media platform had disappeared once the non-disclosure agreement took effect. Bennett had won in the narrowest sense, receiving financial compensation, but lost in every other way. His career was over, his reputation permanently tarnished. Meanwhile, Alexander had resigned from Vertex, but emerged with his integrity intact and a new purpose that many viewed as more meaningful than his former CEO position. As for Imani, she had returned to full surgical duties after the media attention subsided. The few families who had requested transfers were more than balanced by those who specifically sought her out, having been impressed by her dignity throughout the ordeal. Her research continued to advance with a new focus on addressing racial disparities in pediatric care access. When the event concluded, Alexander joined Imani as attendees mingled and networked. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "Did we make the right choice?" Imani didn't need to ask which choice he meant. The question encompassed everything from confronting Bennett initially to accepting the settlement to launching the foundation. It was the question they had revisited repeatedly throughout the challenging year. "Yes," she said simply, taking his hand. "The right choice isn't always the easiest one or the one with the clearest outcome. Sometimes it's the choice that lets you move forward with integrity even when the path is difficult." Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand. "1 year down," he said. "Many more to go." As they moved through the crowd, greeting supporters and sharing plans for the Foundation's future, both recognized the truth that had emerged from their ordeal. The real victory wasn't in court settlements or public vindication. It was in refusing to let one man's racism define their response to the world. It was in transforming a moment of ugliness into a movement for change. Bennett had called Imani a monkey. The world had watched to see how they would react, and in the end, they had chosen to build rather than merely fight, creating something that would outlast the memory of that painful moment and touch lives far beyond their own. That was the real victory. Not perfect, not without cost, but enduring and meaningful in ways that Bennett in his bitter solitude would never understand. Imani settled into seat 2A on Global Airways Flight 835, the symmetry of the moment not lost on her. 1 year to the day since Richard Bennett had approached her in this very seat, making the racist comments that had set everything in motion. She was traveling alone this time, headed to a medical conference in London, where she would present her latest research on reducing disparities in pediatric neurosurgical outcomes. Alexander would join her in a few days after concluding the Foundation's first international symposium in Paris. The differences between this flight and the one a year ago were both subtle and profound. The first-class cabin looked much the same, elegant, understated, designed for comfort and privacy. But the crew moved with a different energy, more attentive and engaged with all passengers regardless of appearance. Dr. Carter Reynolds, a voice greeted her warmly. "Welcome aboard. I'm Miguel, your purser for today's flight. Can I get you a pre-departure beverage?" "Sparkling water would be lovely, thank you," Imani replied. As Miguel moved to prepare her drink, Imani noticed a small pin on his uniform lapel, the Reynolds Foundation emblem, a simple design representing dignity and equality in the workplace. She had seen similar pins on several crew members during boarding, a quiet but visible sign of the changes that had taken root at Global Airways in the past year. The airline had been among the first to adopt the Foundation's comprehensive training program, implementing it initially as damage control after the Bennett incident, but eventually embracing it as a core part of their corporate identity. Customer satisfaction scores had increased, employee retention had improved, and reported incidents of discriminatory behavior had decreased significantly. More importantly, the reporting system had been overhauled. Employees could now document concerning behavior through an independent third party, bypassing traditional power structures that had previously silenced voices like Sophie Winters. Miguel returned with her sparkling water served in a crystal glass with a lime twist. "If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask. Captain Rivera and First Officer Martinez send their compliments and promise a smooth journey to London." "Thank you," Miguel Imani said, noting another subtle change, the deliberate mention of the pilots' names creating a sense of human connection rather than anonymous authority. As boarding continued, Imani observed the interactions between crew and passengers with professional interest. She saw Miguel welcome an elderly South Asian couple with the same attentiveness he had shown her. She watched a young black flight attendant assist a white businessman with his luggage, their exchange marked by mutual respect. None of these interactions was extraordinary in itself. That was precisely the point. Respect and dignity had become the unremarkable standard rather than the exception requiring special effort or recognition. Imani's phone chimed with a text message from Alexander. "Just landed in Paris. All good here. Enjoy your flight. Love you." She smiled as she replied, "Same seat, different world. Will call when I land. Love you too." As the plane prepared for departure, Imani reflected on Alexander's phrase, "Same seat, different world." It captured perfectly how their lives had transformed while external circumstances remained superficially similar. She was still a neurosurgeon, still flying first class to London, still sitting in 2A. But everything else had shifted her perspective, her purpose, even her relationship with Alexander had deepened through shared adversity. The safety demonstration began, and Imani noticed another change. The flight attendant delivering the instructions made deliberate eye contact with every passenger, including those who might previously have been overlooked: an older Hispanic woman in economy, plus a young man in traditional African attire, a mother in a hijab settling her children. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Imani closed her eyes briefly. The memories of that day with Bennett would never fully fade, but they no longer carried the sting they once had. In their place was a quiet satisfaction at what had emerged from that ugly moment, a foundation changing lives, a marriage strengthened, and a personal conviction that standing against injustice was always worth the cost even when the path forward wasn't clear. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air, leaving New York behind. Imani opened her medical journal, ready to review her presentation one last time before arrival. Life moved forward. Healing continued. And somewhere far below, in offices and airplane cabins and workplaces across the country, people were experiencing more dignity because she and Alexander had refused to accept less. That was the true legacy of Seat 2A. Not what had happened there, but what had happened because of it. The Reynolds Foundation's impact expanded far beyond its initial scope in the years that followed. What had begun as a response to a single incident of workplace racism evolved into a comprehensive movement for dignity across industries and borders. The Legal Defense Fund, initially seeded with Alexander's matching donation of Bennett's settlement, grew to support over 200 cases annually. Each victory established precedents that strengthened workplace protections for everyone. Companies found it increasingly costly to ignore discriminatory behavior, with courts consistently upholding substantial damages for violations. More importantly, the Foundation's preventative work training programs, policy development, and cultural assessments helped organizations address problems before they escalated. The certification program became a recognized standard, with consumers and top talent increasingly gravitating toward businesses that maintained it. For Imani and Alexander personally, the Foundation represented a different kind of legacy than either had initially envisioned. Alexander had once measured success by market capitalization, and quarterly profits. Now he evaluated it by lives improved and barriers removed. Imani had always healed individual patients with her surgical skills. Now she also helped heal workplaces with her advocacy and lived experience. Their partnership deepened through this shared mission. The strain that had threatened their marriage during the lawsuit had transformed into a stronger bond forged through adversity and purpose. They had faced Richard Bennett's racism together, weathered the corporate and legal aftermath together, and now built something meaningful together. As for Bennett himself, the final irony of his victory became clear over time. The money he had received, the settlement he had pursued so aggressively, was now enabling the very changes he had most resisted. Every case won through the legal fund, every workshop conducted, every policy reformed, stood as a rebuke to his behavior and a testament to the transformative power of principled resistance. The true lesson of their journey wasn't that justice always prevails in the moment; it often doesn't. Rather, it was that responding to injustice with integrity creates ripples that extend far beyond the original confrontation. By refusing to be defined by Bennett's racism and choosing instead to build something constructive, Imani and Alexander had transformed a moment of ugliness into a movement for lasting change. That was their legacy, not perfect justice, but purposeful response. Not easy victory, but enduring impact. Not forgetting the past, but creating a better future. And for thousands of people who would never know the details of that day on Flight 835 work, had become a place of greater dignity, because two people had decided that racism, even in first class, would not go unchallenged. If you found this story impactful, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us create more content that addresses important social issues through compelling narratives. Share this video with someone who might benefit from its message about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Have you ever had to make a hard choice between what's easy and what's right? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Pilot calls Black woman monkey in first class. Then her CEO husband boards and fires him. For more thought-provoking stories that examine our world and challenge us to be better, check out our other videos.